All right, welcome to our program today, What Lies Ahead for Ukraine, Current Situation and Prospects, with former Ambassador to Ukraine, Stephen Pifer. My name is Laurel Plimier, and I am the president of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont in California. And I want to thank everyone who's joining us today for taking some time out of your day to spend with us on Zoom and on YouTube. Today's event is co-sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Solano County, California, and the League of Women Voters of Portland, Oregon. And we have members from at least 16 different local leagues representing California, Oregon, and Michigan joining us today. So welcome to everyone who is here. Thank you for being with us. Before we get to the introduction of today's guest speaker, I did want to quickly go over a few logistics. If you're on Zoom with us, you can post your questions at any time during the program using the Q&A feature. And feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, let us know where you're joining from. But if you keep your questions in the Q&A, we will be more likely to see them. And if you are watching live on YouTube, you can also post questions in the live chat there, and we'll check that from time to time too. And if you are joining us on YouTube or watching the recording of this event later, please consider subscribing to our channel, and if you click the bell, you'll get advanced notifications of our future live stream events. And if you want notice of upcoming events, you can join our mailing list, which you can do on our website, which is lwvpiedmont.org. You can also become a member of the league there, and about a third of the folks who are registered for this event aren't yet members, so we hope that you will join. We would love to have you. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. We encourage informed and active participation in government. We work to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and we influence public policy through education and advocacy. And when we say that we're nonpartisan, what we mean is that we don't support or oppose any political candidate or political party, but we are very political. We're not neutral on policy. When you join the league, your dues alone support our grassroots efforts, both locally and at the state and national levels. And this helps us in our mission of empowering voters and defending democracy. You can find a local league in your area by going to lwv.org. The league's efforts in voter education and advocacy are extremely important work, and we greatly appreciate your support. So to introduce our guest today, I'm going to hand things over to Jennifer Trainer, who is a member of the League of Women Voters of Piedmont. She's our current voter service director, and she worked for the prior 3 years co-chairing our program committee. So Jennifer.
Thanks, Laurel. I am delighted to introduce today's guest, former ambassador to Ukraine, Stephen Pifer. We are very grateful that he could take time out of his busy schedule to talk to us today. Ambassador Pifer is an expert on both diplomacy and arms control, and has spent his career with a particular focus on Russia, Ukraine, and Eastern Europe. He's spoken and written widely on Russia and Ukraine, and I can highly recommend his Twitter feed, which I read almost every day, as well as his opinion piece last week in The Guardian. I commend those to you. Currently, he is an affiliate with the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford, where he was also a William Perry Fellow from 2018 to June 2022. Concurrently, he is a non-resident senior fellow with the Brookings Institution, where he also worked from 2008 to 2017. He's a retired Foreign Service officer who served more than 25 years with the State Department. His assignments included, in addition to becoming U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Deputy Assistant Secretary with responsibilities for Russia and Ukraine, and Special Assistant to the President as Senior Director for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia on the National Security Council. He served at the U.S. embassies in Warsaw, Moscow, and London, as well as with the U.S. delegation to the negotiation on intermediate range nuclear forces in Geneva. He's the author of many articles and the book, The Eagle and the Trident, U.S.-Ukraine Relations in Turbulent Times. I had the pleasure of being Steve's classmate in college. We both took a class on arms control and disarmament, which he really took to and led him, as he said in the past, to a career in diplomacy and arms control. It unfortunately didn't do the same for me, but I'm sure that our professor, who is one of the SALT I negotiators, would be very proud, Steve, of all that you've accomplished. Please join me in welcoming former Ambassador Stephen Pifer.
Yes, Jennifer, thank you very much for the welcome. Thank you, Laurel. Actually, Jennifer, you remind me of that time in that class, I think one time afterwards, where you were doing a very good imitation of a MIRV bus spewing out warheads at targets across the Soviet Union. Anyway, I'm happy to be here. Laurel, let's go ahead with the questions.
All right. Thank you so much. So what we're going to do tonight, we have a number of prepared questions that we've come up with, and then I'm hoping that the audience will be engaged and ask a bunch of questions also, which we will weave in as we go along. So as I said earlier, feel free to post your questions at any time in the Q&A. So in early February of this year, shortly before the war started, you visited Ukraine, and you predicted that Putin would invade and that the Ukrainians would fight back. And at that time, the conventional wisdom was either that Putin was bluffing, or if he did invade, Kiev would fall in a matter of days. I'm wondering, what did you observe that led you to go against that conventional wisdom?
Well, I think if we were, say, a year ago in early November of 2021, I would have said the Russians aren't going to invade, that the potential costs are just too high for Moscow. I began to shift my view in mid-December of last year after I saw the Russians propose draft agreements, a US-Russia agreement and a NATO-Russia agreement. And when you looked at the terms, my conclusion was these agreements are likely intended to be rejected, and then they can be then another cause the Russians can cite for going to war. And then by early January, both the combination of just the scale of the Russian military buildup around Ukraine and the combination of the rhetoric coming out of Moscow, by early January, I was persuaded that the Russians were going to do something. You also had, though, the US government basically citing intelligence sources and saying from December, the Russians are likely to launch a major military operation. And they turned out to be correct. But many did not believe it. I think most of Europe did not believe it, despite what the United States and also British intelligence were saying. I was in Kyiv on January 30 and 31, so this was 3 weeks before the Russians invaded. Quite frankly, most Ukrainians we talked to, inside and outside government, didn't think the Russians would invade. We had one say, well, maybe they'll do something around Donbas and eastern Ukraine, but they didn't think it was going to happen. Now, the thing, though, that was impressive, though, when I asked Ukrainians who were not in the military during that January visit and said, what will you do if the Russians invade? Most people said, we're going to join the territorial defense forces and we'll fight for our country. And this seems to have come as a complete surprise to the Russians. It looks like the Kremlin, which I believe has never really understood Ukraine or Ukrainians, certainly not Vladimir Putin, does not have a clue. But they thought it was going to be over in a week. They thought the Russian military would be greeted as liberators, and that turned out to be a huge miscalculation by the Kremlin.
So following up on that, what has surprised you? I mean, obviously there are things that, like the huge miscalculation of the Kremlin, what other things have surprised you about how things have played out so far, both in Ukraine and in Russia?
Yeah. Well, starting in Ukraine, the surprise there is, look, I believed Ukrainians would fight. I did not believe that the Ukrainian military would be as effective as it has been. I mean, I would have been quite surprised if on January 31st, you would have said, on November 2nd of 2022, the Ukrainian military will be holding its own and in fact pushing the Russians back. Now, I feel I'm in good company about that. I don't think the United States government felt that the Ukrainians would last. I don't think Western Europe, the Russians certainly did not expect it. But my expectation was that the Russians would likely win the force-on-force battle, but then be saddled for years and years and years with an open insurrection. It would be like Afghanistan was for the Soviets back in 1979 and the early 1980s. So that's one surprise. On the Russian surprise side, just first of all, the fact that the Kremlin so badly underestimated the Ukrainians' readiness to fight and defend their country. I had been astonished by just a whole series of mistakes and evidence of underperformance by the Russian military. I mean, the Russian military, look at the Russian Air Force. Probably it was 10 times the size of the Ukrainian Air Force at the beginning of the war. And here we are 8 months into the war. They have not established air superiority over Ukraine. The Ukrainian Air Force continues to fly. Russian aircraft do not venture beyond Russian lines for fear of being shot down. The poor command structure of the Russians, the poor logistics, their equipment, I mean, basic stuff. One example, I mean, I'm not a military expert, but I read some who are. And if you go back, and this was I think a retired US Marine colonel, and pointed out, if you looked at the Russian tank columns that were advancing on Kyiv in the first couple of days of the war, he said, as they entered an urban area, what you saw was every tank gun was pointed directly forward. And he says, if you would see an American tank column, he said, the first tank, the gun would be pointed directly forward. The second gun would be slewed 45 degrees to the right. The third tank would have its gun slewed 45 degrees to the left. So that you had a much broader range of engagement. That seems pretty basic. And you just saw that, and it probably reflects the fact that in the Russian case, they still have a significant portion of people who are relatively ill-trained. You also saw in the Russian system, I believe, really a continuation of a Soviet-style command structure. Junior officers have very little authority. They do not have sergeants or non-commissioned officers who really run the American army. And the Ukrainians had begun to build that kind of structure, which increased their ability for independent action. So a whole bunch of surprises about just how badly the Russians have misperformed on the battlefield. And it doesn't appear like they're going to be doing much better in the near term.
Can you give us a quick recap of where things stand in Ukraine, both on the battlefield and sort of politically between Kyiv and Moscow?
Yeah. Well, obviously, relations between Kyiv and Moscow have been difficult, going back to 2014 when the Russians seized Crimea, and then the Russians became involved in the fighting in Donbas in eastern Ukraine, which even before this invasion in February had killed 14,000 Ukrainians. I mean, the Russians, there's a real irony here, which is the Kremlin is worried that Ukraine is moving away from Russia and towards the West. I would argue nothing has done more than Russian policy of the past 8 years to push Ukraine away from Russia and towards the West. It's the seizure of Crimea. It was that fighting in Donbas. Now, I think the war itself has gone through really 3 phases. The first phase was from the end of February until the end of March. And that was when you saw this original Russian attack from the east, from the south out of Crimea, from the north out of Belarus, which I believe showed 2 main Russian military goals. One was to capture the capital of Kyiv within the first days, and then to occupy perhaps the eastern half to 2/3 of Ukraine. And it became pretty apparent very quickly that the Russians could not do that. In fact, by the end of March, they withdrew completely from northern Ukraine. All the forces retreated from Kyiv. The second phase was from, say, the 1st of April until maybe the end of July, when the Russians said, our goal now is to capture all of Donbas. Those are the 2 Ukrainian regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, about 30% of which Russian and Russian proxy forces had already occupied prior to the invasion on February 24. Well, in 3 months of brutal fighting, they took all of Luhansk, but then they bogged down in August and were not taking much of Donetsk. And then I think you saw the third phase beginning in August, which is these counteroffensives, which have caught the Russians short, both in the east, where they've now pushed the Russians completely out of Kharkiv Oblast and are threatening now to re-enter into Luhansk and Donetsk Oblasts, and then down in the south on Kherson. And that's important because Kherson is the only place where there are Russian military forces on the western side of the Dnieper River, which roughly bisects Ukraine. And most experts say that because the Ukrainians have managed to destroy all of the bridges, that it's only a matter of time before they drive the Russians out. And so you're now in this situation where, again, to the Kremlin's surprise, I think to the surprise of a lot of analysts, in fact, the Ukrainians have been on the offensive now for about 2 months. There's probably a question as how long they can sustain this. At some point, forces begin to run out of gas, winter's coming, but it's still something that I think was a surprise and a shock to the Kremlin.
Let's turn a little bit to the ending of the war. We're getting some questions through the Q&A, and there seems to be a focus on, how do we get out of this, right? So do you think that there will be a negotiated settlement in the war? How likely is that? And what more can or should the US do to stem the current Russian aggression?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, let me step back. I mean, I think there are three. Well, I used to say there are three possible outcomes. Now I'm down to two. The outcome that I cast aside was that the Russian military might regain its footing and achieve its original goal, capture and occupy Kyiv and perhaps the eastern 2/3 of the country. I just don't think the Russian military is capable of that. And so however this war ends, I would say there's going to be a sovereign and independent state of Ukraine on the map of Europe. And it's going to be much larger than the rump state that I believe the Kremlin intended to leave on February 24. The second possibility, which is more seed.
So your video is frozen for me. I don't know if others are seeing the same thing, Jennifer.
It's going to be a war of attrition.
Okay, we lost you for a second. Your video was frozen. So maybe go back to the second. You were just starting the second possibility.
The second point would be that, in fact, the Ukrainians succeed, that they push the Russians back to the lines on February 23, at least, if not completely out of Ukraine. And I don't exclude that, but that's going to be hard. When you go from a defensive battle to an offensive battle, certain advantages are on the side of the defense, and that would be on the side of the Russians. So the third possibility, which I think is probably the more likely, is that, as the US intelligence community has projected now for several months, is at some point this war settles down into a war of attrition, where neither side makes a decisive win, and then it could go on for some time. And then the question to my mind is, does it reach a point where mutual exhaustion, the sides both reach a point where there's a real negotiation, where both sides are prepared to negotiate seriously? Now, I don't think that's possible now. And in fact, it may sound odd coming from someone who spent 27 years doing diplomacy. I don't think that there's much room for US diplomacy. A number of my colleagues in the think tank community said, well, the US should be pushing Russia and Ukraine to negotiate. I don't see that being worthwhile now, because I don't see Moscow prepared to negotiate seriously. The Russians had a slew of demands when the war began. They wanted denazification, which basically meant replacement of a government in Kyiv that was headed by a Jewish president. By the way, they no longer call for denazification. As of last Tuesday, what they're calling for is the de-Satanization of Ukraine. And I kid you not, that actually was a language used in a statement put out by the Russian Security Council, as reported by TASS. They want demilitarization, they want neutrality, they wanted Ukraine to recognize Crimea as Russia, and they wanted Ukraine to recognize the two so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states. Well, in the last 2 months, even though the Russian military has been losing on the battlefield, the Russians now have a new demand, which is that Ukraine accept and recognize these annexations of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, these 4 parts of Ukraine that Putin declared on September 30th. There's nothing to negotiate, and there's nothing that anybody who's pushed for the US to press the sides to come together, there's no evidence that they've cited to say that there's any readiness on the part of the Russians for a real negotiation. On the Ukrainian side, I believe the Ukrainians actually were prepared to negotiate very seriously in March. They were prepared to accept neutrality. They may have even been prepared for some territorial concessions, but that changed in the course of March, and it changed when the Ukrainians took back places like Bucha and Irpin, and they saw, the torture chambers, the mass executions, the deportations, and what that's done is it's hardened the attitude, understandably, on the part of the government, but it's also hardened the attitude of Ukrainians. So that's narrowed the ability of the government to negotiate if it wanted to. So there may well be a time for a real negotiation, but I don't see it happening until, first of all, there's a significant change in the negotiating approach in Moscow. And then I think it should really be a Ukrainian call. If negotiations are to begin while there's still Russian forces on Ukrainian territory, that's a tough call to make. And I think that's when we need to leave the Kyiv.
So what can the US do? And, if negotiations are sort of off the table, is there anything else? Obviously there are certain thresholds, and this comes from an audience question also. There are thresholds for the NATO and US involvement. We're not going to use nuclear weapons and things like this. What will it take for us to become more involved, and how close do you think we are from moving down that path? Yeah,
well, this will seem counterintuitive, but I think what the West can do now to increase the prospects of negotiations is to continue and increase the flow of weapons to Ukraine. The better the Ukrainians do on the battlefield, the more territory that they can liberate, that, to my mind, increases the chances that there'll be a change in Russia's position. So to the extent that they can shape the battlefield in a way that may make that negotiation down the road more likely. And I do think that the United States and NATO have done a lot. I think they can do more. There is one firm red line that President Biden's expressed and NATO's expressed, which is they said, we are prepared to provide weapons to Ukraine, but we are not prepared to send American and NATO troops to fight for Ukraine. And that's a very clear red line, a hard one, and I think it's the right line. And my reasoning is this, is Russia can lose this war against Ukraine, and it will not be existential for the Russian state. The Ukrainian army is not going to march on Moscow. Now, it may be existential for Mr. Putin's political prospects in his career, but the Russian state is going to survive. However, were the United States and NATO to enter with their troops on the side of the war against Russia, I think for many in Moscow, it would fundamentally change how this war is viewed. It would then be seen as existential, and the American and NATO entry would be seen as evidence not of a desire simply to defend Ukraine and help the Ukrainians drive the Russians out, but as indicating an intention to destroy Russia. And at that point, I think the escalation prospects become pretty murky and perhaps pretty scary. So I think they set the right red line, but within that red line, it seems to me that we can provide Ukrainians more. And the Ukrainians have proven very good at adapting Western equipment and using it to good effect.
Going back to the possibility of negotiating, or the difficulty in negotiating, if there were some negotiation to come out of the current situation, how can Ukraine and the rest of Europe avoid a repeat of what just happened happening again 2 years from now?
This is a really good question. And it's, I believe, one reason why Ukrainians are very skeptical of a ceasefire. And because a ceasefire, presumably, unless it was accompanied by a full Russian withdrawal, would leave Russian troops occupying part of Ukrainian territory. And the fear is, an understandable fear, that the Russians would use that ceasefire basically to regroup, reconstitute forces, and then at the time of their choosing, attack again. So, if, because I do believe there will be an end to this war at some point, but when that war ends, it seems to me that there are a couple of ways that we could help Ukraine be in a position where it would be assured that there would not be a repeat of this. Now, one is what the Ukrainians said that they would like. The Ukrainians say that they would like to be a NATO member. And I can understand that. I mean, Article 5 of NATO says an attack against one will be considered an attack against all. But I think that that's, at this point in time, it's an overreach by the Ukrainians. Because in order for Ukraine to become a member of NATO, you would have to have all 30 current members, and after Finland and Sweden, and it'll be 32, all 32 countries would have to say, yes, we are prepared to go to war with Russia for Ukraine. And I don't think you have that readiness on significant number of NATO members at this point. So what I've suggested, and I've argued to Ukrainians, is you're probably not going to get that now, but what they should be talking to the United States, European countries, and others about is asking for commitments to help them build a modern military. This would be things like providing M1 tanks from the US, German Leopard tanks, modern air defenses, even an air force, but to help Ukraine develop a modern military after this war that would be so strong, the Russians would look at that and say, we don't want to try that again. And an argument I've tried to make Ukraine is it will be easier for leaders in Washington and Berlin and London and Paris to say yes to that kind of commitment, to provide you the equipment so that you Ukrainians can defend yourselves, than to, in the near term, give the commitment that would come with NATO membership of being prepared to go to war against Russia for Ukraine.
Along those lines, is there a way to build a foundation for lasting peace along the Russia-Ukraine border? I mean, not just for ending this particular war, but moving forward.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really hard to see, and I think you only get to that point after a long time. I mean, what's happened, and this is unfortunate. I mean, Ukrainians and Russians, you talk to Ukrainians now, there's a degree of societal enmity towards Russia and Russians. And I remember asking a Ukrainian friend a while back, I said, is the anger directed at Putin or at Russians? And he said, it's directed at Russians in general, because they've allowed Putin to do this to us. And I don't know how, I think that's going to take years or decades to overcome. So it's going to be, I think, a very difficult relationship between Russia and Ukraine. And, it's going to require some fundamental changes, I think, in how Russia views Ukraine. And this is one of the problems here. And I think there are a variety of reasons why the Kremlin chose to go to war. I'm not sure that you would have had this war, though, had there been another leader in the Kremlin other than Vladimir Putin, who appears to have a very flawed historical view of Ukraine, appears not to accept the idea that Ukraine has the right to exist as a sovereign and independent state. And when he looks at Ukraine, he says, well, most of modern Ukraine are what he calls historic Russian lands. And he says, we Ukrainians and Russians are one people. Again, that's something that most Ukrainians now firmly reject. And that includes Ukrainians who are in the eastern part of Ukraine and who are more likely to speak Russian than Ukrainian as their first language. Another Ukrainian friend once told me, he said, Vladimir Putin has succeeded where centuries of Ukrainian nationalists have failed, is he's given Ukraine a strong national identity. And I think, unfortunately for the Russia-Ukraine relationship, Putin's actions have imbued that national identity with a very strong hostility towards Russia, understandably.
So do you think, given that Putin still believes that he can create the Novo Rossiya?
Yeah. Well, certainly his military actions suggest that he thinks he can do that. I think the Ukrainians are proving every day that militarily he cannot do that.
Hmm.
And so, to my mind, I mean, this is it's a battle now. I mean, the question is, do the economic sanctions, which I believe are having a negative impact on the Russian economy, but more importantly, the flow of casualties. And now that you've gone to this mobilization, it's not just Russian volunteers who are getting killed. It's 300,000 people now have their fathers, sons, brothers are now mobilized. I think the Russians said 80,000 of them have now been sent to the front lines. All of a sudden, a lot of people are getting killed and wounded who didn't want any part of this. Does that begin to sour the public mood? And it's interesting that while Putin has built this very autocratic system in Russia, they do a lot of polling, and they do follow public mood. Does the public mood switch? Or do you have within the elites, perhaps even the inner circle, somebody look at this war and total up the cost for Russia, which I think this has been a disaster. You're talking now probably, well, the Pentagon said in early August that they estimated 70 to 80,000 Russian soldiers killed or wounded in action. That would have been like 40 to 50% of the original invading force. At that rate, you're talking now probably on the order of 100,000 dead and wounded Russian soldiers. Those costs, huge losses of equipment, the loss of the Russian military's reputation, economic sanctions, political actions. At some point, people would have to be saying, this really is a disaster for us, and what are they hoping to achieve? So I think there is some chance that will in Moscow to continue this war can be eroded. But it gets back to, again, I think Ukraine continuing to record success on the battlefield.
So moving that one step further, if there is all of the negative opinion on many levels within Russia, is it possible that Russia would eventually break up? I guess there's some experts who believe that is a possibility. How likely do you think that is, and how long would it take to get to that point, continue on our current trajectory?
I'm not sure if that's a big possibility, but what I do wonder is if you look at the casualties initially, it seems to me, I mean, and I have no numbers to do that, this is just anecdotally, but it does seem that the bulk of the casualties thus far are coming places like the Russian Far East, from the Caucasus region, from Tatarstan. And my guess is that ethnic Russians, people from Moscow and St. Petersburg are getting killed at a much lower rate. If that begins to be seen more broadly, I think that could cause an incredible amount of resentment towards the Kremlin. And that would be a factor that might cause the Kremlins and the Russia to begin to sort of loosen up. But I think that that's still a fairly small possibility. Let me also say that I don't believe that the breakup of Russia is actually a good thing for American interests. We got lucky when the Soviet Union collapsed. Remember, one of the real concerns was all of a sudden you had nuclear weapons in a whole bunch of different countries, concerns that nuclear weapons might leak out to terrorist groups, things like that. I'm not sure we want to be dealing with sort of nuclear armed statelets in Russia if we're Russia to break up. It creates a power vacuum. What does it do for China? So I don't think that would bring a lot of problems to American policy. I would much rather see Russia stay intact, but end this war and basically come to terms with the fact that it's no longer the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, and that it ought to be finding ways to live in peace with its neighbors.
How likely do you think that is to happen with Putin still in power, or is it inevitable that Putin cannot hold on to power in order for Russia to have that awakening?
Yeah, well, I think Putin's built a system that's designed to protect him, and probably has fairly tight control over the inner circle and the security services. But I still think there's a small chance that in that inner circle, people are going to really question the wisdom of what he's doing. and the costs of what I think is a very badly miscalculated war. Now, the problem that you have is if you're in that inner circle and you think maybe it's time for Putin to retire to that billion-dollar palace that's been built for him down on the Black Sea, you probably can't do it on your own. And choosing who you ask the question of is going to be a pretty consequential decision on your part. So I think it's small probability, but not zero. In the same way that I think it's small probability that the public opinion massively turns against this war in the near term in a way that causes the Kremlin to change course. But we'll have to see. It is hard, though, for me to say that. I mean, after what we've seen, I personally wish it were otherwise. I've spent more than half of my career in the Foreign Service trying to find better relations between Washington and Moscow. But I don't see the United States and Russia moving back towards anything that looks like normal relations with Mr. Putin still in the Kremlin. I think it's got to be past him.
So you talked about the regions within Ukraine that Russia has its eyes on. Do you see other countries at risk of Russian invasion? And would there be a possibility of any of those countries that aren't as able to defend themselves in the same way that Ukraine has?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting. This, again, I think, is the result of how Russia has treated its neighbors. In the Caucasus, you have Georgia. Remember, South Ossetia and Abkhazia were once parts of Georgia. They're now under protection of Russian military forces, and Moscow has recognized them as independent states. I think maybe 6 or 7 countries in the world, like Nicaragua and Syria, joined the Russians in those recognitions. But most of the countries in the world still see those as parts of Georgia. And actually, somebody was wondering, would this be a time for Georgia to sort of make a move? Probably not. Kazakhstan is interesting. Kazakhstan has a huge border with Russia. And in the last several years, you can point to statements by not Putin, but by some fairly influential Russians saying, well, that northern part of Kazakhstan is mainly inhabited by ethnic Russians. And it's been interesting to me that Kazakhstan over the last 8 months has taken a fairly independent stance to the point where in July, or maybe it was June, President Tokayev of Kazakhstan appeared on a stage at a press conference with Putin. And when the question came up of recognizing the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states, which of course Putin did back in February, President Tokayev said, "We're not going to do that. Those are parts of Ukraine." Now, the other countries that I think are nervous, the Baltic states. They're nervous about this, and they've been, I think, raising attention actually since 2014, saying, this is not the Russia that we thought we had as a neighbor, going back to, say, 1997, when you actually had the founding of a NATO-Russia arrangement. And they also, I think, trot out some maps and say, well, if you look at historic Russian land, the Baltic states were once historically part of Russia. Now, of course, they're members of NATO, but I think they are nervous. I had a chance with a Stanford travel study group to visit Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania in August, and people there are a bit rattled by what the Russians are doing. And their question is, if this is about Putin regaining historic Russian lands, where exactly does that ambition stop?
I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the stuff that's been going on. And I'm not sure how much this is within your expertise, but so there's a lot of evidence of war crimes and other atrocities against civilian populations. What do you think the chances of anyone seeing any repercussions of that, any convictions?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think there's massive evidence of war crimes and atrocities, to my mind, and it's you see it in places like Bucha, Irpin, Izium, Liman, the mass graves. What the Russians did to Mariupol in a 3-month siege, which reportedly left 90% of the buildings in the city either damaged or destroyed. Bear in mind, by the way, the Russian military did that to Mariupol. Mariupol in eastern Ukraine was a city where the ethnic population was almost half ethnic Russian, and where over 90% of the population used Russian as their first language. And the indiscriminate shelling, and you see the indiscriminate shelling now is, when the Ukrainians attack warships this weekend of the Black Sea Fleet, the Russians respond by flinging indiscriminate missiles into Ukrainian cities. So I think there's a lot of evidence of that things that would qualify as war crimes. The Ukrainians are investigating them. Countries, the French have had a team in there to help investigate. And in some cases, the Ukrainians are saying, we can identify, we know the names of the people in this unit who were in Bucha and committed these crimes. Now, the hard part about bringing them to justice is most of those people are not going to ever leave Russia. So even if the Ukrainians and those countries that assist them can bring legitimate charges to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and The Hague then puts out arrest warrants, as long as they stay in Russia, they probably will never face accountability. But having said that, I think if you go back and look at Yugoslavia and that nasty breakup there, people did not expect that Milosevic would ever wind up in The Hague, and he had his chance to go there. So I think it's unlikely, but I wouldn't say it's impossible. And there is a worthwhile reason to begin, building cases, and to the extent that's possible, attaching specific accountability to individuals in the Russian military and security services.
So historically, or at least in the somewhat recent past, the Ukrainian government was significantly corrupt. There were issues with corruption. What do you see as the potential for continued stable democratic government in a post-war Ukraine?
Yeah, well, once we get into the post-war period, Ukraine is going to require a significant amount of help to rebuild, and we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. The West has now frozen about $300 billion in Russian central bank assets. I think it'd be entirely appropriate for Western governments to move to actually seize that money and put it into a fund to help Ukraine rebuild, because it's going to be a long, expensive task. But I hope that, the West will be assisting Ukraine to rebuild, as it should. But I hope that when we do this, we bear in mind, the opportunity to build back better. And it will mean pushing the Ukrainians to do some things that the Ukrainians really haven't done in terms of coming to terms, with ending types of corruption. And we may have to get kind of transactional on this. But the argument that I would make to Ukrainians now is, look, addressing corruption and building a truly competitive economy, it's not just a matter about standard of living, and having your people not have to deal with day-to-day corruption, but it really is a national security issue, because the resilience of your country to withstand pressure from the Russians in the future will depend on having a strong functioning economy. And because of the failure of governments, and quite frankly, before the war, I would say the Zelensky government had a mixed record on reform, but those failures to really come to terms and address corruption and put in place the full set of reforms, they had a real cost. Had the Ukrainian economy performed at the rate of the Polish economy right next door, it would have been 2 to 4 times larger than it was on February 24th, and it could have supported a much larger military to defend itself. And that'll be an issue for the Ukrainians in the future.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about Europe. So Europe is very dependent on fossil fuels, as is most of the world. Do you perceive that Europe is responding to the war by accelerating investments in fossil-free clean energy economies that could minimize that dependence and could shift a little bit of what is possible for them as a reaction to the war.
Yeah, no, I think Europe, in hindsight, made a mistake. They became too dependent on Russian energy sources, both oil, but also natural gas, particularly that came through via pipelines. And that's understandable. Gas that comes via a pipeline is usually less expensive than gas that comes in an LNG tanker and then has to be converted back to regular gas. But again, this is one of the surprises to my mind, is that Europe seems to be in a relatively good position for this winter, a much better position than Europeans were expecting, say, back in June and July. So, for example, typically, the way Europe operates is they fill their gas storage tanks until end of October, November, right about now, and then they will begin drawing that gas down to get through the winter. Well, in late October, the European underground storage tanks were at about 90% of capacity. So that's pretty good. And actually, because of the prices now, there are actually LNG tankers sitting off of European ports that are simply waiting for the space to go in and unload and provide more gas. So I think the Europeans have a fairly decent chance. It also helped if this is a mild winter, and at least, knock on wood, whenever I can find some wood. Thus far, the projection seems to be that at least the first half of the winter is going to be relatively mild. So when I was in Germany 3 weeks ago, I took away the feeling that the Germans think they can get through this. It's not going to be easy. Everyone's turning down their household temperatures. Some large companies that consume a lot of energy, may shut down for 3 weeks over Christmas. But it looks like they can get through this winter into the spring. And then they've got to press the effort to continue to find ways to diversify away from Russian energy. But Europe has said, I think, that by the end of this year, they intend to cut their purchase of Russian oil by about 90%. So they're working to make progress. Gas is going to be a little bit harder. And now what it's also doing in Europe is, Europe has had in the European Union some very ambitious climate change goals. So they had the plans. What I think you'll see now is an acceleration of those plans as they move more towards solar and wind energy. And that will also then help pick up some of the slack from Russian energy. So we'll see. They can get to next spring. The question will be what's like the next winter. Is that how hard that will be? But the good news is that people seem a lot more optimistic in Europe about their ability to manage the cutoff of Russian energy than was the case, say, 3 to 4 months ago.
I'm going to circle back to do one follow-up question within Ukraine, and then I'm going to shift to a little bit more about the US, because we have a bunch of questions piling up that people are interested in. So the follow-up question, I don't think you touched on this when you were talking about the different regions within Ukraine, but how much support was there by the majority of Ukrainians, residents in Donetsk and excuse my pronunciations, and Luhansk for actually being either independent or okay, maybe we're okay with being absorbed by Russia? What is the majority opinion there?
Yeah, okay, I'm going to go back to a dated poll because I really don't trust polls that have been conducted in that area in the last 8 years. But there was a very interesting poll that was conducted, I think it was either in March or April of 2014. So bear in mind, this was, it would have been, I think, March of 2014. So this was after the Maidan Revolution. And it was conducted in Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, the regions in the east there. And the polls showed that a majority of the population was not comfortable with the Maidan Revolution. A majority of the population, even though they saw the Rada, that's Ukraine's parliament, as a legitimate institution, did not regard the acting president and the acting prime minister appointed by the Rada after then President Yanukovych had fled the country. They didn't see them as legitimate. But it still showed that more than 70% of the population wanted to see their areas remain as part of Ukraine. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, that was really kind of interesting to split the vote. They were clearly not supporters of the Maidan revolution. They were uncomfortable by it, but they still saw their place as Ukraine. Now, I think it's very hard to do a polling in those areas now because probably 1.5 million people left the area and became internally displaced persons elsewhere in Ukraine. Maybe another 400,000 or 500,000 went to Russia. So a huge part of that population is left. And my guess is had you taken a poll in that area prior to the Russian invasion in February, the answer that would win is please make it stop. We just want peace. Because what the Russians did, and I think this is a tactical mistake by the Russians, it's for 8 years when the Russians looked at Donbas, they focused on the military side, and that was supporting Russian proxy forces that were occupying Donbas. They put very little into, other than sort of basic humanitarian aid, into making the life for people in occupied Donbas normal. So you had local warlords running things. There was no rule of law, no protection of property rights. And my guess is most people would have just said, we don't care. We would just like this to stop.
You talked about the, I think you said 400 to 500,000 people who went into Russia. Were those voluntary relocations?
I think some were voluntary relocations. I think some had relatives in Russia. I mean, this is one of the really, there between Russian and Ukrainians, there's a lot of family connections, friend connections, things like that. I think a lot of those have been unfortunately severed since then. But a lot of Russians or a lot of Ukrainians went into Russia. And my guess is that was not discouraged by the Russians. In fact, there are now reports of forced deportations into Russia. And if you're in Moscow and you're looking at Russian demographics, you have a difficult situation. I mean, there are about 145 million Russians now. The projection is that gets down to close to 135 million by 2050. And you already have decreasing numbers in the demographics that are in your working populations. So my guess is that there's some in Moscow saying these people can help us deal with a very difficult demographic situation. And my guess is some of these deportations are not voluntary. And what I think has been particularly upsetting is continued reports of children, orphans, but also kids separated from their families, being deported into Russia and then being adopted by Russian families with no effort made to sort of reconnect them back with their families in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's troubling. So I want to shift gears now to talk about the US and what the US is doing. What do you think is the best way to bolster and sustain US public support for supplying both humanitarian aid and direct military aid to Ukraine? Yeah,
well, I think the administration probably, this is kind of a lost art, and this is not just this administration, but I remember back in the 80s and 90s, when you wanted to lay out a policy, you have the president or the secretary of state give a really long speech and lay everything out. And I think that there's a lot of support in the United States for Ukraine, a lot of which is instinctive. Americans like the underdog. And in this case, Ukraine, it's clearly the victim, it's clearly the underdog. But I'd like to see them sort of spread out, to describe at a very high level, what are the key interests here at stake? And let me give you 3 or 4 interests. One is, for almost 80 years now, the United States has had a strong national interest in a stable and secure Europe. I mean, Europe is an economic partner, it's a political partner, it's a security partner. Well, what's going on now between Russia and Ukraine is going to have a huge impact on what kind of Europe we deal with. And, I'm one who says I focus on Russia, but I think the big strategic challenge for the next 3 decades for us is China. If we don't get Europe right, if Russia prevails in Ukraine, people who work on China are going to find that they have fewer resources, less American military power, and less senior level time to focus on China. Second thing I think we ought to worry about is international norms. The international norms, I think, generally serve America and American interests well. Well, one of the most basic international norms is that you don't use military force to take territory from another country, which is exactly what Russia is doing. And to the extent that these norms get shredded and that Russia is able to get away with it, I think we move closer to a dog-eat-dog type of world, which is going to be less conducive to achievement of American interests. The third thing I worry about is that it goes back to Mr. Putin and his ambitions. He gave this talk back in St. Petersburg in June to a group of young Russian entrepreneurs. And he said, Peter the Great, they say he conquered the Baltics. No, he didn't conquer the Baltics. He was recovering historic Russian land. And then Putin went on to sort of equate himself with Peter the Great, claiming what I'm doing in Ukraine, it's not aggression. I am recovering historic land, Russian land. Well, the Baltic states, if Putin's ambitions go further, we're going to find that at that point, we do have a security commitment. We do have a commitment to use American military force. And what I would worry about is if Putin prevails in Ukraine, does he then make what would be a huge miscalculation and try to go to one of the Baltic states? And that will be a case that will not be just providing American money and weapons, it will be providing American soldiers. And finally, one last point, and I cite this, and I have to confess, I feel personally under this. I negotiated in the early 90s Ukraine's denuclearization. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine had on its territory the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, 1,900 strategic nuclear warheads. They could have incinerated every American city with a population over 50,000 3 times over. And Ukraine got rid of those weapons in large part because of what was called the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, in which the United States and Russia pledged or committed to observe and respect Ukraine's sovereignty, its independence, and its territorial integrity, and committed not to use force or threaten to use force against Ukraine. When we were negotiating that, Ukrainians said, what happens if the Russians violate that? And we said, we will do stuff. We'll take an interest. Now, we did say one thing. We said, it's the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances, not guarantees. We said, we're telling you now, we're not going to send the 82nd Airborne to fight for you, but we will do things. I think what we're doing now, though, is certainly in the spirit of what we told the Ukrainians 30 years ago we would do. And, it was a commitment we made to them at a time that we hoped and we assumed. And one of the problems was in 1993, neither we in Washington nor our colleagues in Kyiv saw Vladimir Putin coming. Had I think the Ukrainians seen what was going to happen in 2022 or 2014, getting rid of those nuclear weapons would have been a much more difficult question. So I think those reasons, and explaining the Budapest Memorandum, I think that would be useful, basically to reinforce what is an instinctive American desire to be on the side of the underdog, and also to bolster support in Congress, where traditionally going back to the 1990s, there's been bipartisan support for Congress. But I've got to say, apologies, I'm getting a little bit partisan here. I do worry about the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, and I also worry a little bit about the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So we saw 2 weeks ago, Kevin McCarthy, who hopes to be the next House leader, say that no blank checks for Ukraine. I think that was a silly, the stuff that's going to Ukraine actually is audited pretty closely. And then you had a Democratic letter, which was issued, then withdrawn, that wasn't talking about cutting off money, but was talking about negotiations. And as I explained earlier, I think at this point in time, negotiations don't make a lot of sense, maybe at a future point.
You answered one of my follow-up questions with that. The one additional point, I'm wondering what your take is, or how would you respond to the large numbers of just regular people, not politicians, not foreign policy experts, but just regular people who are concerned with the United States spending so much money overseas when we have so much that we could be spending money on here domestically?
Yeah, I would say I would understand that completely. I do understand those concerns, but again, I think if we lose if Ukraine loses this war, and if Russian ambitions expand, think of the costs that are going to be involved if there actually is a NATO-Russia conflict, which the administration thus far, it's trying to help Ukraine win the war, but also avoid that NATO-Russia conflict. But if Putin's ambitions go beyond Ukraine, we may not be able to avoid the latter, and that's going to be costing hundreds of billions of dollars. And more importantly, it's going to be costing the lives of a lot of American military personnel.
One final topic, and then we will wrap up, is we haven't really talked on it in detail. What are the chances of nuclear weapons being used? And can you talk a little bit about the dirty bombs that people have been talking about Russia potentially using in Ukraine?
Right. Let me break that question into two parts. First, a dirty bomb, which sounds scary, it's radioactive, but actually, I've spent some time talking to people about a dirty bomb. The dirty bomb, you would take a conventional explosive, you would wrap it in some kind of, radioactive material, you would detonate it. Most experts I've talked to say that if you know what you're dealing with, the casualties are just the people who are killed or injured in the explosion of the conventional explosive. But that if you then know it's a dirty bomb, you get the people, you shower, you decontaminate them, you're going to have a problem then cleaning up the area. But it won't be a mass casualty event, certainly not on par with an actual nuclear weapon. And the concern about the dirty bomb was that the Russians keep talking about it. That raised concerns that this might be what we call the false flag operation, that the Russians might in fact do some kind of a dirty bomb event in Ukraine and then somehow try to blame it on the Ukrainians and then use that as some excuse to escalate. So I believe that's one of the reasons why the US government, the British government, NATO have been sort of calling the Russians out on this, is to take away from Moscow that ability to create a false flag incident. On the nuclear weapon question, and the concern here is that if the Russians cannot prevail at the conventional level, would they escalate and use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine? Now, I think we should take the threat seriously. Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. It has a large number of tactical nuclear weapons. Vladimir Putin is somebody who does not like to lose or back down. And at every really key juncture you've seen in the last 8 months, he seems to have doubled down. He doesn't back up. He pushes on and he escalates in some way. And it's compounded, to my mind, by the fact that he makes miscalculations, beginning with his huge mistake of launching this war in the first place back in February. Now, having said that, I think there are also reasons to be a bit more relaxed about it. One is the Russians have sent mixed signals. So even last week, Putin himself said, who's talking about us making nuclear threats? We're not doing that. And today, the Russian Foreign Ministry put out a lengthy statement on preventing nuclear war. It repeated the statement that goes back to Gorbachev and Reagan in the 1980s, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And also reiterates Russian policy, which is they would only use nuclear weapons in the event of an attack on Russia or a Russian ally with a nuclear or other weapon of mass destruction, or a conventional attack on Russia in which the existence of the Russian state is at stake. So the foreign ministry is trying to reassure people there. The other point I would make is Putin doesn't want to have a nuclear war. What he does want is he wants us in the West and Ukraine to think he's ready for a nuclear war, because he wants to use that to intimidate Ukraine into conceding and surrendering, and he wants to intimidate the West into cutting support off for Ukraine. Now, again, I think there are real reasons why, and my guess is the Russians possibly understand this. One is, for the Ukrainians, a tactical nuclear weapon detonating in Ukraine would not achieve the political effect of having Ukraine surrender. Because what the Ukrainians have seen is, after 8 months, they've seen what happens when they surrender. It would be subjecting a much larger portion of the Ukrainian population to the torture chambers, the filtration camps, the deportations, things like that. I don't think that use of a tactical nuclear weapon against Ukraine would cause the Ukrainians to give up, I think it would just further intensify their resolve to prevail. Second, the Russians have to ask themselves about the global South. If Russia now, and this is global South, India, China, they've tried to sort of stay on the sidelines of this. But I have to think that the foreign ministry in Moscow would be advising the Kremlin that if you use a nuclear weapon, you're going to lose India, you likely lose China, and you may lose all those other countries who would, I think, be appalled by the idea of Russia, a country with 3 times the population, 10 times, more than 10 times the area, attacking Ukraine at the conventional level, not succeeding, and then using a nuclear weapon. Because all of those countries would have to say, what kind of precedent does this set of a large country using a nuclear weapon against a small country? So I think at that point, Putin then finds he becomes a true global pariah, which is something he's tried to avoid. He now says, well, I don't have a relationship with the West, but I can talk to Modi in India, I can talk to Xi in Beijing, I can talk to others, and such. But I think that closes it. And then the third thing is there have been pretty strong statements from the West, which have said that if Russia uses a nuclear weapon, that there would be extraordinarily serious consequences for Russia. And I have to believe, Putin, he may be so focused on Ukraine that he's kind of not thinking all of the costs and benefits through. But I have to think that people, for example, in the Russian military, understand that once you cross that nuclear line, you're in a totally new game. The rules then are almost unknown, or at least they're suspected, but they've never been tested. And you've opened up a Pandora's box, and the consequences are nasty, unpredictable, and potentially catastrophic, including for Russia. So I look at that and I think at base, Putin, his judgment may be clouded somewhat, but I think he's basically a rational actor still. And there are other people around him who would understand that the risks and costs of using a nuclear weapon for Russia far outweigh whatever goal that they might hope to achieve in intimidation. So again, Putin doesn't want to use a nuclear weapon. He doesn't want nuclear war, but he wants to use that threat out there to make us nervous. And if we show our nerve, I think we can see our way through this. One last point is also, if we were to cave to that nuclear threat, we better understand that Putin's going to learn a lesson, and we're going to have to face nuclear threats much more frequently in the future.
Yep. I really appreciate your taking the time to be with us today. And I'm very grateful to all of the questions that everyone asked in the Q&A, some very thoughtful questions that I really appreciate. I did want to remind everyone that Election Day is coming up in just 5 days, and please vote if you haven't already. And please visit your local league's website to find information on voting in your area. In Piedmont, you can find our election information on our website, which is lwvpiedmont.org/votes. And also, if you are in California, you can visit votersedge.org to find unbiased information about candidates and ballot measures. And if you're in Oregon or other states, please visit vote411.org to get this information. We will be sending a follow-up email to everyone who's registered for this event that'll include the link to the recording for the event. And feel free to share that with family and friends who are unable to join us live. And finally, we do have a virtual panel tomorrow evening called Roe versus Wade 2022 and Beyond, and that is sponsored by the Alameda County Council for the League of Women Voters. You can register for that event on our website, also lwvpiedmont.org. And we hope to see you there. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you are watching us on YouTube for easy access to future events. And if you aren't already a member, please join our local League of Women Voters. Thank you again to Stephen Pifer, former ambassador for Ukraine, joining us today. And this officially ends our program.
Thank you, Laura. Bye now.